because they just want to play, and I think that's awesome.
Right, they're just they're musicians, but
Right,
I mean,
right.
it's hard enough to find the horn player and then find the female. Just to find a female who even likes death metal is a rarity. So
Yeah,
you
well,
got that factor too.
They're definitely kicking some ass, and I got to give Becca a lot of credit because she'll jump on any instrument that she can play, and she'll play it with us.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, and she's really awesome. She's a real tough chick, too. And I want to give a shout-out to Dennis because he used to be the full-time bass player, and then when Alan had to go and start his own project, who I'm actually playing guitar in his new project, too. When he had to leave to go and do his project because it was time for him to do his own thing, Dennis jumped from bass onto guitar, and it's been seamless. He's done such an amazing job.
Cool.
And he's working with Tim the drummer really, really well. And I'm really, really, really excited that he's adapting to it. And he's that's another thing too, is that I'm so happy that all of my friends in this band, they all play multiple different instruments. We have a lot of things that we can do, and there's nothing kind of blocking us creatively because we have so many musicians that play multiple instruments, and Dennis plays like 13 or 14 different instruments well. Jonathan plays every single percussion instrument, including marimba, hand percussion, timpani, drum set. So we're really blessed to go and have the quality musicians that we have where we can just go and play whatever we want and not even be too concerned about what genre it is. In fact, 40% of the stuff that we do isn't even necessarily metal. I mean, you heard it. We've got that kind of proggy song on the EP. And then we have a total hand percussion song that is the title track of the EP. So you definitely hit the nail on the head when you call this experimental because we're just trying really hard to just be authentic, using the real instruments as a first step.
Right.
And whatever you hear on the recording is what we recorded at the speed in which it was recorded. And there's very, very, very little editing going on these takes. If anything... If there's any editing, it usually has to do with a bad microphone where I had to go and fix it on the fly in post-production. But you're not hearing drum replacement. You're not hearing, and outside of the kick drums, you're not hearing anything that's really triggered. You're not hearing any samples, any digital samples. You're not hearing reamping. That's a microphone up to a cabinet, and we turned it up and we recorded it. So it's much harder to go this route because if we're doing everything direct and doing everything where we're focusing a lot more on the post-production being the bulk of the production, then it kind of defeats the whole purpose of using real instruments because then at that point you might as well just use the samples.
Right. I hear you.
But everything that you hear on the recordings, that's us. And that's something we take a lot of pride in. And I really do appreciate the fans out there who have gotten into us and the more raw sound. And that really makes me feel great because, like I said, I grew up in the Long Island death metal scene, which was all raw, it was harsh, it was brutal.
Yep.
And I would not be able to live with myself if I didn't at least try to take that approach a little bit, even with a brass metal band.
I hear you. Now, do you do all of the songwriting, or does everybody, you come in with a structure and everybody adds their own parts? How does that work?
Well, that's a really great question. The brass instruments are really the ones that add the most, I guess you could say, the most from the creative standpoint, because a lot of times we're writing songs based on the talent that we have, and people like Austin and Rich on the last recording, they were kind of incorporating some of their own style into the music. But I would generally write, let's say, 95% of the material. Tim throws the drum beats at me, and he's almost always spot on, like the first or second take. And the real structure and the real songwriting comes down when I work on the rhythm tracks with John. So what we have to do is I gotta write the guitar parts, and I bring the song to John Katz, the timpani player, and we map the entire rhythm out of the song. And he's planning in his head as far as what he's going to do with the timpani, and he's finalizing it once he hears what happens with the drums. So it goes guitar, timpani, and drums, and then we put that together, and then what we do is we layer the second guitar tracks on top of that, the solos, and then we'll take the brass instruments and a lot of the rhythm that we're using of the brass instruments is essentially based on what the timpani is doing, or is going kind of counter to what the timpani is doing. So the timpani really is like the foundation of the brass section, and I work on each kind of component with each of the musicians in the band. But what's great is that they all have some really amazing input, and we're kind of growing out of this situation here where I'm writing every single phase of the music, where now we've got more input from the brass and from the timpani section, so that we can kind of build much more on the brass section and have the better musicians really kind of driving that, as opposed to, just the guitar player who can play a couple of solos, but I'm not nearly as good as some of these other guys as far as musically. So everything is done in components, but I'm pretty much involved in just about every stage of every part. And the other brass musicians are kind of coming in with a little bit more input right now, which is really taking the brass section to a new level.
What is the response like live when people see you guys for the first time? Do they come back and see you again, or?
Oh yeah, we have a really cool handful of dedicated fans in Central Florida, and we always sell T-shirts and CDs too. People are digging this stuff. But the response live, usually when we first get on stage and they see these horns and in some cases when we have the timpani on stage, they're like, "What the hell is this?" And then we start playing, and we usually get a really good response, and there's always good positive things that people are saying. And I think the reason why, again, it goes back to what I was saying before about that sort of Long Island death metal upbringing. If in my mind, when I get up on stage and I'm playing in front of the Florida crowd, which is an unbelievable crowd of people. I mean, the scene itself is not what it used to be in the 90s, and it's hard for a new band to kind of break into the scene around here, but there's so many bands, and they're all really hard-working, especially bands like Killing Addiction and of course Nocturnus and Erode and all these bands that we played with, Denied Till Death. They all work really hard, but when I'm getting on stage, I'm visualizing what it was like on Long Island and in New York. And if you get on stage in New York in 1993 and you were not pushing the envelope and you weren't going and putting 110% in, you weren't trying to be as aggressive and as assertive as possible with your music, and people were just going to basically walk out, and they were going to be like, yeah, this is cool and everything, but you just don't have it. And they wouldn't be afraid to tell you. That's how it was. I don't know if you remember that, but in the early 90s, if you weren't any good, meaning if you weren't fucking brutal or if you weren't extreme or if you weren't musical, they would just be like, I'm not going to support you. You suck.
Right.
And you would hear that. So I still kind of have that in the back of my mind. So when we're doing this stuff, we're trying to be aggressive, regardless as to what kind of style that we're sort of incorporating, whether it's more aggressive death metal or the brass part, or if we're just doing like a hand percussion type of song. It's got to be extreme. It's got to have that same attitude. And I think a lot of the fans in Florida that have heard us have appreciated the fact that we are essentially a Florida death metal band. We are death metal, with or without the brass and with or without the timpani. We're still a death metal band. And that's what we are, and that's what we're going to be. Even with these instrumentals or these prog-ear type of things, we are still a death metal band. And they appreciate that, and that's probably the most rewarding part about this musically, is that we can still be a death metal band and have the freedom to incorporate these other ideas and get a good response and get good support. But without the death metal component, Jay, this band doesn't exist. It's pointless and it's useless to go and do this without maintaining those death metal roots, which will always be there. And no matter what people might say that are kind of from the new school about how the sound should be a little bit more polished, should be a little bit cleaner, it's not my background. That's not where I come from. It's not where the rest of the guys in the band come from. That's not our thing. We need to have a little bit of that grit. We need to have a little bit of that harshness, because that's the point. If we wanted to be nice and pretty and cute, number one, we wouldn't be playing death metal.
You'd be playing pop songs.
Exactly. Exactly. We wouldn't even be using the raw, real instrumentation, because you can't get a perfect sound, a perfect wave file from a one brass instrument. So think about it. If you got, the beauty about brass is that it's a flawed audio signal. It's not perfect, and it's the imperfection of the sound that gives it its timbre, that gives it its beauty, that gives it its character, that gives it its power. You have a real human being pushing all the air from their lungs out of an instrument to make a tone. That is a very, very, very powerful thing. And when you see live brass, the first thing you think to yourself is like, man, this would sound great in a death metal band. So that's a really rewarding part of this, is that we've got people that are into death metal and people that are not into death metal that are appreciating this type of stuff, right, because it appeals to more than just one type of demographic. And I appreciate that, because we put a lot of time and a lot of work into this. And when we got people that are saying, you know, man, I didn't know if I was going to like that whole brass thing, but you guys definitely do. You sound like Star Wars metal. And I'm like, hey, man, I'll take it. Because you know, I mean, just the whole cinematic aspect of it's a big part of it. But
absolutely.
But I definitely appreciate the support and the open mind, which surprised the brass players in the band too, because, like, you know, I had no idea that people were actually going to like this. And I'm like, well, people coming out to see us, man, and they're buying our CDs, right, requesting us on the radio station. So it's a fun thing, and I hope that other bands out there pick up on some of these ideas and start incorporating live instrumentation. You know, I would love to see a band out there go and pull out a couple of trombone players and do this style of music. I'm like, that'd be wonderful, because it'd be less music that would be incorporated in keyboards.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. It's funny, because Ice Cube was on Howard Stern today, and he mentioned that, you know, that all these kids today don't know how to play instruments, and he was saying how he don't know how to play any instruments, and he regrets that, because whenever he has to go record something, instead of using a sample, he's got to go get this old cat that plays bass from 50 years ago to play it for him. So it's something that's really lacking in a lot of today's music, is the way it's done, is the process. So keeping it raw and true to playing real instruments is something good. I mean, I like music raw. I like my polished stuff too, but again, coming back from that Long Island sound back in the day, as far as death metal and the hardcore scene, that's where all of that originated, the punk and all of that. So, I mean, that's definitely a big thing for me.
Oh yeah, and I talked to Chris Pervelis from Internal Bleeding sometimes, and sometimes they'll talk about the hardcore scene, and you know how New York slamcore or slam death metal kind of evolved from the crossover between New York death metal and the New York hardcore scene, and you know, they were never pretty about it, and this whole pretty, dainty, easy to listen to crap that's out there now. No disrespect to the guys out there that are doing music, that are doing metal. It's really just not for me, and it has nothing to do with the style. It has everything to do with the attitude behind it. And I think you can hear attitude in the way that the music is played. And if I don't hear attitude in the way music is played, it sounds sterile to me. That's why I keep going back to bands like Suffocation, and bands like Pyrexia, because you heard those musical dynamics and those little nuances that made that stuff so interesting and so appealing, and it's something that you can't duplicate. So I think that there is a big problem right now in metal that's kind of relying a little bit too much on technology. I mean, there are some bands out there, I'm not going to name names, but I think you know what I'm talking about, and it's not just one band. There are many bands that are doing this now, where they'll go and they'll record at one speed, and they'll speed it up in post-production to make it sound like that it was recorded in another speed. And that frustrates me a lot. That really, really frustrates me, because you have any idea how easy this would be if I took that kind of approach? I mean, I'd be able to go and put out a song every 3 days.
Right.
And it's frustrating. It's frustrating because I got some bad reviews because of the low budget production, and it's really frustrating. I'm like, you know, this reviewer over here just reviewed this band that what they recorded isn't what you're hearing. And yet, because it sounds perfect with nice rounded edges and it's all nice and easy, even and pleasing to the ear, but it's not metal. It may sound like metal. It may